So I'm very excited here to be talking about this topic because it's something that happens to all of us, how we can better articulate our value as executive assistants, particularly in interview environments. So our session today, this isn't becoming louder. This isn't about being someone that you're not. It's not about owning the room. It's not suddenly having a totally different personality, because you don't need to be someone else to be able to articulate your value. What we're doing today is we're going to put some language around how you can talk more confidently about what you already do. So by the end of today, I want you to walk away. My intention is for you to get one sentence that you can use in interviews as your anchor. And you can also use this in networking or casual conversations like family barbecues. It's just going to give you a clearer internal sense of what you bring to the table and how you can talk about that in a really productive way. So quick heads up on how today is structured. So I want to explain why I'm going to be spending so much time on the background information today, because I'm actually going to spend the whole first half of our time together explaining why this actually feels hard. Because I know that most of you people in the room here today, you don't have a skill problem. What the actual problem is a translation problem created by the social hierarchy in our workplaces. So what's happened is that you've learned to describe your work in the least controversial way so that you don't overstep or make anyone uncomfortable. It's part of the job, smoothing things over, right? But it doesn't play to our favor when we start looking at the interview environment. So if I give you tools without naming the underlying pattern, like what's going on in the background here, you're just going to keep self-editing the tool and we're not going to make any progress. So what we're going to do is we're going to name it first, we're going to understand the actual problem, and then we're going to build that one practical sentence that you can use in interviews and real world conversations. So here's the roadmap today. Part one, we're going to look at what that self-editing actually looks like. And why, when people say, so what do? You say, oh, everything. Let's look at why that actually is happening. Next part, we're going to look at that social hierarchy, how that affects where you sit in your role and how you talk about your role, and also how the effects of burnout can actually really have a big impact on shrinking your language over time, because that's a key factor here. And then in the third part of today's session, this is the practical bit. This is where we build your anchor sentence. And we're going to also learn a really simple way to build answers that sound like you. So if you're thinking, when do we get to the tool? We will. I just want you to actually be able to use it. All right, let's start properly. So first up, let's stop pretending that this is something that is really simple. And this might seem obvious, but I don't hear it said out loud enough. If articulating your value was simple, most of you wouldn't be here in the room in the webinar today. You wouldn't need a webinar. You wouldn't need coaching. You wouldn't need frameworks. You'd already be doing it. And yet I work with incredibly capable, intelligent, experienced executive assistants who tell me the same thing over and over again. I know I'm good at my job. I know I do a lot, but when someone asks me to explain it, I freeze up. Or I walk out of interviews thinking, why didn't I say any of the important stuff? I just rambled. So if that is you, nothing is wrong with you. You are not bad at communication. You are not bad at understanding the value that you bring to the table. What's going on here is you've actually adapted. What you're experiencing, it has a cause. And until you understand that cause, yes, it might feel like a bit of a personal flaw. So tools don't work if your workplace training is still running the show. So let's switch that off first. Here's the reframe. Most EAs, they're not bad at talking about themselves. They're not bad about talking about their work. What we're actually doing is a form of self-editing, because we've learned over years how to scan a room. We've learned what is safe to say. We've learned what gets rewarded, and we've learned what gets you labeled difficult. We've learned what gets you labeled easy to work with, and we've learned when to shrink language, where to soften those edges, where to downplay our impact. And it's not necessarily a conscious thing. It's societal, it's political, it's workplace training. Look, it's not about overstepping. We don't want to offend anyone, do we? We don't want to sound like we're inflating ourselves. So when we are in an interview environment, and the interviewer suddenly says, "So, tell me about your role," your brain doesn't go to accurate description. Your brain goes to what's safe here, what's accepted. And safe usually sounds quite small. It's a pattern. You didn't wake up one day bad at expressing yourself. In fact, as executive assistants, we're actually usually fantastic communicators, really, really good at emotional intelligence, really, really good at putting words around the value that we bring. So what we've actually done here is we've adapted. It's kept us employed. It's kept everyone around us comfortable. It's kept us trusted. So we're not trying to delete that part of you that can do that. In fact, it's one of the core skills that makes you wonderful at your job. What we're going to do is teach that part of you some new options. And that's why the tool matters that we're learning today, because we're building language that you can use without tripping that don't overstep alarm that you've got in your head. So I want to start by talking about that everything answer that always seems to come up. So when someone asks you what you do and you say, honestly, everything, people laugh, you smile, the conversation moves on, but inside there's often this quiet thought, oh, that's not even close to the truth, but I don't have the energy to explain the rest. So you don't say everything because you lack awareness. You say it because the real answer is layered, and giving the real answer can feel quite awkward, like it might sound too big or too self-important, or it might just sound like you're overstating your role. So everything, it becomes a socially acceptable shortcut. It doesn't raise eyebrows. It doesn't make anyone uncomfortable. It doesn't require a long explanation. But the real answer would require you to explain things like, how you manage competing priorities, how you decide what becomes urgent and what doesn't, how you protect your executive's time, how you read between the lines. So these are not bullet points, and they don't fit nicely into job descriptions. And historically, support roles have not been encouraged to talk about that level of thinking. We've been encouraged to talk about tasks, calendars, emails, travel, board minutes. So when we say everything, what we're really saying is, I do a lot of invisible work that I don't quite have the clean language for. And that makes sense, especially because we know that a lot of that invisible work is judgment. And we're going to be talking about more of that in a moment. So the problem with the everything answer is that when people hear everything, they don't imagine judgment, influence, complexity. What they imagine is busyness. They imagine someone who is helpful, but not necessarily strategic, not someone who is high impact, not necessarily someone who is operating at a senior level. So the word everything, while I understand exactly why you're saying it, what it does is it undersells you in a big way because it's incomplete. And again, that's why that tool that we're working on today matters. We need to build some language here that we can use that conveys our value without tripping that don't overstep alarm that we've got. Okay, so I'll share a little bit of a story here. So this happened to me early on in my EA days about one of the roles that I took on. And look, when I took the role, I knew the job description was really vague, but I probably just wasn't savvy enough early on in my career for that to trip the red flags and alarm bells that it probably should have. And then before I knew it, within 6 months, I was running what can only be described as all 7 departments, but taking credit for none of it. I was doing tender writing for contracts that I was not paid enough to even pronounce. I was coordinating the marketing. I was running events. I was handling procurement. I was managing OH&S documentation. I was doing unofficial HR for executives who are having very big feelings. So, and yes, if you've heard my sugar story, it is real. The CEO of that company called me on my personal phone at 8:25 p.m. on a Wednesday because there was no sugar for his coffee. Actual sugar. This was treated like an emergency. He dialed the CFO in on the line. I remember standing there on my front porch, my phone in my hand, thinking, when did this become my job? And also, why am I answering this call? But what I actually did, I sorted it out. I didn't push back. I didn't say this isn't reasonable. I didn't say this isn't in my remit. I laughed it off. I stayed easy to work with, not because I thought that it was appropriate, but because I didn't want to be difficult. I didn't want to look precious. I didn't want to be seen as someone who makes things hard or will only, work on the high level work. I think I'm bigger than what I am. And in doing that, what I actually did was I taught everyone something about me. I taught them she will do everything under pressure. She will just absorb the pressure. She will make problems disappear. She'll do it quietly. She'll do it without needing acknowledgement. And look, my behavior trained them to think about my role like that. Here's the uncomfortable part. When we consistently present ourselves as the person who just handles things, people stop asking what it costs you to handle them. They stop seeing judgment. They stop seeing prioritization. They stop seeing decision making. All they see is admin, and that's the cost. Because if you hold the whole building up long enough without talking about it, keeping everyone comfortable, people stop noticing the structure. They just assume that things work. And look, I see EAs doing this every single day. We become so good at making our job look easy that everyone around us forgets that it's actually very complex, sometimes including you. And that's one of the other reasons that today's topic matters so much, because we don't struggle to articulate our value because we don't have any. We struggle because we've spent years presenting the smallest, least controversial version of our work. And that's what happens when you're good at this job. So today we're going to widen that picture. All right, part 2. Let's talk a little bit more about the self-editing that I mentioned at the beginning. So I want to dive into why most EAs don't struggle because they lack insight or communication skills, like I said. They struggle because they've learnt how to calibrate themselves inside a social hierarchy. You're constantly reading the room. You're constantly looking for what lands, what irritates, what feels welcome, what feels like overstepping. You're so good at it, it probably doesn't even feel conscious anymore. This is just something that becomes part of our experience. We really notice in our workplace who gets labelled a great operator, a safe pair of hands, who's easy to work with. And we also notice who gets labelled intense, political, hard work, too ambitious. So you adjust. You soften, you round off the edges, and you learn to speak in ways that keep things smooth. And not because that reflects your capability, it's because it keeps relationships working. That's social intelligence and that's professionalism. But here's the unintended consequence of this. What happens is you get very, very good at describing your work in politically neutral language. And like I said, politically neutral language, it tends to sound small. And then what happens? Underneath that self-editing, there's something very practical that's going on. It's called social risk management. So we're constantly scanning and thinking, will this sound like I'm overstating my role? Will it make someone uncomfortable? Will it sound like I'm claiming territory or results or outcomes that aren't specifically just mine? And look, when the stakes are high, you don't become less capable, you become more careful. Like in interviews, when you feel under pressure, that's when you go blank. Your mind goes a bit foggy and you might ramble or minimize. And that's important because what it means is that you're not actually bad at interviews. You're over-calibrated. You're actually really just fantastic at doing things that this exact role needs. So some of the sentences that EAs carry quietly, I'm going to read some of these out loud because I want to see what lands for you and just see how this feels in your body. So if I say this properly, will it sound arrogant? If I'm honest about my capacity, will they think that I'm bored? If I explain what I really do, will they worry that I won't stay? If I speak confidently, will it look like I'm coming for someone's job? And if I stay vague, at least I'm not threatening anyone or getting anyone offside. If any of those thoughts are familiar, it doesn't mean that you lack confidence. You don't have imposter syndrome. These kind of thoughts, it means that you're recognizing patterns. You understand organizational politics and you've adapted intelligently. But these intelligent adaptations, they can become really expensive over time because they train you to describe your work in a way that is a lot smaller than what it actually is. And then how does this show up in interviews? You walk in, they say, so tell me about your role, and your brain goes, okay, what is the least controversial version? So you default to talking about tasks, like we said, calendars, emails, travel, meetings, coordination. Useful, true, also incomplete. Because what the interviewer is actually trying to understand is how you think, how you prioritize, how you can handle really complex environments and competing priorities, how you support decision making. But you've been trained to not lead with those things when you're talking about yourself and your work. So that's where the mismatch is. Notice that that mismatch is not between you and the role. It's between your language and the level that you actually operate. I want to make a note here on burnout as well, like I mentioned, because burnout, it really changes the way that you describe yourself. It's something that really adds to this problem. And because I know so many of us experience burnout at different levels, at different times of our careers. So I really want to raise this as a point today, because also, burnout is often the exact time that you're facing interviews because you're looking at making a change. So I think it's really important that we just make a note here and cover it. Look, yeah, burnout is really common in EA roles for good reason because the whole job is, scanning for problems, being hyper vigilant. You sense when something's off, you smooth things over before they blow up, and most people never see that work. They just experience the absence of chaos and think, it just happens. And that takes a toll. So there's a special kind of burnout to being an EA. And after a while of experiencing this, many of us start thinking, oh, I don't want to be on all the time. I need a break. So, you start looking for something simpler, something quieter. And notice it's not because you've lost capacity. It's because you want a little bit of your peace back, a little bit of your ability to enjoy your own life back, right? I did this myself. I see clients do it all the time. So what we do is we start applying for roles that we could do with our eyes closed, roles that look simpler, roles that look lower pressure. And, the thought in the back of our head when we're doing this is that maybe I need to step back. That what's really going on is we're trying to lighten the load and look for relief. But what actually happens? Low scope roles very rarely give relief to high capacity people. What they do is they give boredom, they give frustration, they give that trapped feeling. So that underutilization that you might be chasing there is not an actual rest situation if you're a high capacity person. It's just stress in a different kind of outfit. And when burnout shapes our language, the way that we're talking about our role, ourselves, our ambitions for the future, the words that we use actually have a massive impact on our trajectory, even when we don't mean it to. So it's really important that we link this. Because when burnout hits, you don't just change what you look for, you change how you describe yourself. You might have noticed this. You stop naming your strategic abilities. You stop naming the way that you have good judgment. You stop talking about influence. You stop mentioning the thinking part of your job. And you flick across to just talking about the mechanics because the mechanics feel lighter, easier, tick the to-do list, it's less loaded, it's safer. But when we start getting to interviews, that sounds like I'm great at admin, not I support decision making. I support decision making. And this is really important to take note of here because the point that I'm making is that your language shapes your trajectory. And it's really important that we do that intentionally. Because shrinking your language, it can feel like relief, but it comes with a cost. We start filtering ourselves into smaller rooms, roles that have got less scope, less influence, less trust, not because that's what we actually want, but because that's what your language is pointing towards. Language shapes trajectory. And a lot of the time you end up in a situation where you've outgrown the room that you have talked yourself into because the roles that you end up with when you're heading that way, they're built around execution. So some roles are built around execution, just a tasks list, ticking them off, and some roles are built around judgment, prioritization, and translation. If you're wired for judgment and strategy, but you keep aiming for execution-only environments, you're going to feel restless, not because you're too much, but because you're misaligned. And misalignment often starts sounding like, oh my goodness, I don't even know what I'm aiming for anymore. I don't know how to explain what I do. It's not that you don't know. It's that your language is not matching and or fitting to the level that you actually operate. There's another note that I want to make here as well that I think is really important, and that is, of course, the impact of AI. And we're going to dive into this a lot more in various webinars in Q1 this year, particularly if you're in the APAC region. But I just want to touch on it here because we do know that there is another layer underneath everything that we're talking about today, and that's that the EA role is changing. It's not disappearing, it's not shrinking, it is changing because AI really is starting to take care of more and more of the transactional tasks. So, like the drafting, summarizing, scheduling assistance, all of that kind of first pass admin. And a lot of headlines on LinkedIn and wherever else are saying, support roles are at risk. I don't see it that way. What's actually happening is that the task layer of the EA role is thinning out, which means that what's left becomes more visible. And that's the part of your job that was never simple to begin with. So this is where we're talking about the judgment, the context, prioritization, knowing what matters, knowing what doesn't. So knowing when to interrupt and when to wait, knowing what not to escalate, all of these things that can't be automated in any meaningful way. All the things that rely on your ability to understand people, your ability to understand dynamics, understand that nuance and that timing. So in other words, the EA role isn't becoming smaller. What it's doing is becoming sharper. That's a good thing. But here's the catch, because when the work becomes less task heavy and more judgment heavy, vague language stops working. Everything, I just do a bit of admin, I just do general support. Those phrases, they don't describe what the role is becoming, and that gap is just widening. And that's why articulation of your value can feel even harder than what it used to. Not because you're doing less, but because the work is by nature more abstract. It can be harder to see and name. So again, if you are struggling to answer questions about what you do in your role, you're not confused. You're operating in a role that has outgrown its old language. Which brings us back to translation. So articulating your value. This isn't about making yourself bigger than what you are. It's not about exaggeration or pretending. It is about translation. So taking the work that you already do and putting it into language that other people can recognize. So especially in environments that have got any kind of power dynamics as well. So instead of saying, I feel like I could add more value if I had more autonomy, you say, if I own this, it removes more noise from your plate. So it's same truth, different translation. That's fluency. So we're not being arrogant in the way that we're talking about our role. It's just using the right words and the right language. And once you see this, once you understand the problem behind what's actually going on here, you stop trying to, be more confident. You start learning a different language, which is exactly what we're about to build here. So if you've ever felt foggy or stuck or unsure about how to explain yourself in these situations, it's because your role has outgrown its old language. So let's build some new language. I'm about to give you one sentence structure that does two things at once. It sounds really human out loud, and it lets you be accurate without sounding like you're overstating your role. That's the whole goal. So let's dive into looking at the tool here. All right. Up until now, we've talked about why articulating your value feels hard, how that self-editing develops, why burnout and shrinking make sense, and how that even further impacts the way that we talk about ourselves, and why there's nothing wrong with you if you struggle to articulate all of this in a single sentence. So now let's move on to the practical part and putting some language around what you already do. Because most EAs, we don't struggle because we don't know our value. We struggle because our work, our quality, valuable work, it lives in decisions, in judgment, in timing. We've mostly been taught to talk in tasks. So today I want to shift that from tasks to judgment. from activities to what you're actually responsible for keeping steady. So the idea is around something I like to call an anchor sentence. So this is not a magic wand, but what it does is it gives you something to hold on to, because under pressure, your brain, it needs somewhere simple to land. One sentence that you can come back to whenever your mind goes blank. A sentence that feels true, grounded, like something that you could actually say out loud, not corporate speak or job description speak, not something that, is all polished and LinkedIn worthy, something that is human, true, and expresses what you actually do. So here's the structure. Where you sit, what you look after, what that allows. And that's it. Easy, right? Not tasks, not software, not lists. Let me give you a few examples of what this framework actually looks like in real life. So here's some examples that sound like real people. I support a senior leader and I look after the flow of priorities so they can stay focused on the right things. Or I help keep work clear and moving so decisions don't get messy. Another one that's really good is I work closely with the leadership team and look after the day-to-day chaos so they can concentrate on the bigger picture. And one of my favorite ones is I'm the person who helps turn a lot of moving parts into something manageable so things don't fall over. Something I want you to notice here is none of these sound fancy. They're not overstated. They sound normal, but they're accurate. So what to listen for as you're developing your own sentence? When you're testing your sentence, how does it feel in your body? Does it feel steady? Could you say this out loud to another human without cringing? Does it sound like you? If it feels true, you're close. If it sounds impressive but fake, scrap it. We want to do truth first, polish later. The next level to take this to as well is your decision zone. So one layer deeper here, instead of thinking about what you do, I want you to think about what you regularly decide. So this lens is really helpful here because that's where your real value sits. So for example, you decide what's urgent and what can wait. You decide what your executive needs to know and what they don't. You decide when to interrupt and when not to. Maybe you decide what gets followed up and what can drop. These are not small decisions that we're talking about here. These are trust-based decisions. So that's what I want you to focus on. So here's the activity. Grab your note paper and jot down the finishing to this sentence. A big part of my job is deciding. You might come up with some things like, what matters most today. A big part of my job is deciding what needs attention now versus later. What my executive should be across, what risks to flag, what can be smoothed over. These are incredibly senior statements when you put them together. A big part of my job is deciding what needs attention first so my executive isn't constantly firefighting. So these sound senior, but they also sound like something a real person would say. So I want you to play around with that in your notebook and see what you can come up with there, because we're going to use that now to build your anchor sentence. So we're going to combine those things together. Oh, there's some more examples on the screen there for you. Beautiful. Okay, building your anchor sentence. Where you sit, what you look after, what that allows. That's it. So you might end up with something like, I support a senior leader and I help decide what needs attention and what can wait so that they can stay focused on the right priorities. Nice. Or I work closely with the leadership team and I look after the flow of work and information so that decisions don't get messy. Or something like, I sit alongside my exec and help keep things clear and moving so that they can focus on the bigger picture. Now, none of these sentences are perfectly polished, and they don't need to be. What they need to be is usable, because what we can use this sentence for, it's not just interviews. There's the examples that I just gave. I should have flicked across to that slide a moment ago. You can screenshot that one if you want some examples. Okay, yes. So this sentence, it's not just for interviews, although that's their primary use, but you can also repurpose this for networking when someone asks what you do, when you're introducing yourself in meetings, even when you're at the family barbecue and you're getting to know other people. Whenever your brain blanks, this anchor sentence gives you somewhere to land that isn't shrinking yourself. You're not self-editing. This is something that is real, that is human, but it encompasses your actual value. There's a common fear that I want to call out here as well. Some of you might think, if I talk like this, will I sound like I'm overselling myself? I want you to shut that voice down, because the truth here is that you are not overselling. What you're doing is you're telling the truth without deleting yourself, shrinking yourself, without self-editing. So we're not claiming a different role. We're just naming the one that we already perform, but we're doing it in a really positive, accurate way that tells the fullness of our true value. And that sits in our judgment and in the decisions that we make. So I hope that really helps. I know I want to give one more example here. An EA who I worked with recently, she used to introduce herself really just focusing on saying that she manages people's diaries and inboxes. When we changed that to her saying a sentence along the lines of, I support a senior leader, I help decide what needs attention and what can wait so that they can stay focused on the right priorities. That's the same person, that's the same job, but a totally different language. And she told me after we did that work together that for the first time in an interview, she didn't feel like she was apologizing for her role. That's the shift. It's not louder, it's not bigger. I think the best word to describe it would be that it's steadier. And my client there, she actually progressed to the next interview stage and she started getting those better quality conversations. So the anchor sentence really is the starting point. Refine it so that it fits you, your experience, the roles that you're targeting. Making it more specific like that, it does take some work, but it's very worthwhile doing as an exercise. If you would like some further assistance with that, or if you've got any questions, please do reach out to me, even if you just want to pressure test the language that you're using. Like I said, you can find me on LinkedIn, and if you want to dive deeper, you can book in that phone call as well as an option. So if you've spent years doing work that only gets noticed when it isn't done, all those invisible things, it makes sense, of course, that you struggle to explain it. And also, as EAs, we're trained to make things work quietly. We're not trained to narrate our impact, but we don't do everything. We keep things steady so other people can do their jobs well. So if you can start with one true sentence, that alone can really have a massive impact on the way that you walk into rooms, because you're not imagining that it's difficult to talk about your work. That's true. It's just been unnamed for a very long time. So thank you for being here. I really hope that this has helped you understand a little bit more about what's going on and how you can create that anchor sentence so that you can speak more confidently about your value in the workplace. So thank you again for being here. Please reach out if you would like to speak further soon, and I hope to see you at another event in the very near future. Bye for now.